Today's Moravian text is Luke chapter 9 verse 12 to 27. Two parts to our reading. Jesus feeds the 5,000. It's a miracle that we've considered as we've journeyed through Matthew and Mark in our Moravian text readings. And then we move into this section where Peter gets a revelation that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God. Both stories are about a revelation of who Jesus is. The first happens in public. It happens before a huge crowd of people. Jesus is revealed. And the second is a private revelation, something between Jesus and his disciples, those who draw close. What I find interesting about that, well, I find all of it interesting, but what I noticed about the feeding of the 5,000 today is the way that it builds from yesterday's reading, where Jesus gathers his 12 disciples. And it says in chapter 9, verse 1, that he gave them power and authority, that he sent them out with power and authority to preach and heal, to do the things he'd been doing. And that's what they do with a fair amount of success. But now here they are with Jesus, and they almost default back to expecting Jesus to sort everything out for them, to do it all himself. I was thinking it's a little bit like parents. As your kids get older, you give them more and more responsibility, more freedom, involve them more. But then every so often, in those awkward teenage years, they almost revert back at times, wanting you to do it for them. Or maybe when you're a student and you have been living this adult independent life, and then you go back to the family home and you revert back. Or maybe you're developing someone in leadership, but when you're around, they become passive, they take a back seat. And that's a bit of the dynamic that's happening here. So Jesus, being the world's greatest ever trainer and coach and developer of people, he pushes it back to the disciples. He invites them into the miracle, to be participators in the miracle. So Jesus is like, right, disciples, put them into groups, into 50s, organize them, get them to sit down, and then start to hand out what you have. And of course, that's when the miracle happens. It's in their hands as they distribute it. And I think that often we can get stuck into one of two errors. On the one hand, there's this error of just passively expecting God to do everything for us like he did for us when we were baby Christians. But then as we mature in the Christian faith, we find that, well, for example, miraculous breakthroughs in our finances, they come as we obediently practice generosity. That's when the breakthrough happens in our hands. Or that breakthrough in our emotions and our feelings comes when we choose to drop our case against that person that's upset us or offended us. And we choose the way of forgiveness, to practice forgiveness. The miracle, the change happens in our hands. So if one error is to passively expect Jesus to do it all for us, then the other error is to frantically put a plan in place and do it all ourselves. Right, let's make a quick count. There are 5,000 men, there are 12 of us, so if each one of us go to a different village to collect bread, then we'll be able to feed them. And of course, that's an equal error. And the sweet spot is that place where we invite Jesus in, where we listen to his direction, where we obediently step into what he says to us. So that's the feeding of the 5,000. We then have this private encounter. Jesus says to his disciples, "Who do the crowds say I am?" And then he pulls it right down to the personal. But what about you? Who do you say I am? And Peter makes this confession. And that's what it is. It is a confession. It's more than a statement. It's more than an idea. It is a revelation reflexing with confession, with faith. From his heart, the mouth speaks. And the same is true for us. That's how it works. We believe in our hearts and then we confess with our mouths. Romans 10 verse 9 and 10. It is a reflex. Believe, confess. Revelation, confession. And what that revelation, that confession does is then it opens up a new layer of application. When the penny drops, when the light bulb gets switched on for Peter and the disciples, or for us, when we realize who Jesus is more clearly, then we always have this second revelation that starts to unfold. It's who we are and how we are called to live in the light of who Jesus is and how Jesus lived. And what we see here is that second revelation is all about the cost of discipleship. It's an invitation into a life of surrender and sacrifice, a life that imitates Jesus and his purpose. Now, when you have not had that revelation of Jesus, when you're not living with that revelation of his greatness, his majesty, his power, his beauty, his compassion, his mercy, when you're not in that place of revelation, then the call to discipleship, to surrender, is always too great. But when we see him, when we behold him, then surrender, sacrifice, taking up our cross is as natural as blinking when poked in the eye. It is a reflex to revelation. So let's keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. And in our discipleship, as we invest in others, let's call those people to do the same, to focus on who he is. Amen.